So once again, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Irene Batun-Bakal, president of Columbia Alumni Association's NorCal chapter, alongside our NorCal Columbia Alumni VP, Dan Lee, and our partnered alumni groups, Columbia Alumni Association SoCal chapter, Penn Club of Silicon Valley, and Brown University Alumni. On behalf of NorCal Columbia Alumni Association, we would like to thank you for our partnered alumni groups for this joint effort to highlight alumni and their work and sharing events. As it is our goal to connect and share events and knowledge beyond our networks, we look forward to provide you with future opportunities and collaboration. So with that said, I have the privilege of introducing our event moderator, who will be introducing our featured speaker, a journalist, co-founding editor of the Occupied Wall Street Journal, an alumni from Columbia University's School of Journalism, and author of Generation Occupy, Reawakening American Democracy, Michael Levitin. You may be familiar with Michael Levitin's work featured in the New York Times, The Atlantic, CNBC, and Fast Company, and we look forward to hear more of his work in the future. So to commemorate the 10-year anniversary of Occupy Wall Street, our interactive discussion serves to highlight one of the most important movements against social and economic inequalities in our generation and its impact on today. So moderating our event is Michael Stoll, who is the executive director of the San Francisco Public Press, a journalist, media critic, journalism educator, and also an alumni from Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. So everyone, let's give a warm welcome to Michael Stoll, who will be introducing us to Michael Levitin.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for participating. I have known Michael Levitin for more than 10 years. We were colleagues doing local journalism in San Francisco, but that's not the least of his journalistic adventures and pursuits. He's reported all over the world and had many adventures doing environmental and political reporting, and has just a wealth of experience to draw from. This book is an important book. I feel like it is a must-read for anyone who is looking for meaning and hope for our democracy and the planet right now. And I hope people don't think that that's an understatement if they pick up the book and read it. Michael Levitin, you weave a clear anti-establishment critique through deft writing of using the tools of history and journalism, and it's deeply researched. The book that it reminds me of the most is Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. So I thought that maybe if you didn't use the current title, you could rename it A People's History of the Last 10 Years. I think it's that compelling a read. So you make a bold claim that the national labor movement's fight for $15 an hour, the anti-pipeline environmental protests, Bernie Sanders' critique of the 99%, and Biden's current political agenda, none of those would ever have happened had a bunch of ragtag activists camped out in the rain in Zuccotti Park near Wall Street 10 years ago. You make this case persuasively through a combination of careful journalism and participatory perspective. So I want to actually maybe start with the present and then work backwards, since that's probably what is on everybody's mind. President Biden was never anyone's left-wing standard bearer. I think we can agree on that. But he is now less than a year into his tenure leading a remarkably progressive coalition. So to what extent was this political agenda of his current administration and by extension, the federal government, generated from the bottom up during the decentralized Occupy Wall Street movement in 2011. Is this what you're saying? What was new and different about this political protest movement?
Great. Thank you, Michael. Thanks to the Columbia alum and people who invited this, and thank you to everyone taking part tonight across this land. That's a great place to start, Michael, and thanks for the words about the book. I think politically, the relevance, you're probably hitting it kind of on the button. The thing that most maybe resonates at this moment are the political impacts from Occupy Wall Street, which I think most people aren't really out there voicing those connections. I think the 10th anniversary came and went last month on September 17th. And, a few outlets, people recognized it. They said inequality is in the conversation now. Occupy changed the language around the 99%. They put a focus on the super rich, et cetera. But I think that a lot of people have failed to see that truly our politics of right now, this moment, where progressives in Congress and then the progressives who pushed Joe Biden to become less of a centrist and more of a champion of the future generations and a genuine progressive seeking to abolish student debt, to establish paid childcare, college-free tuition for community colleges, tax the rich in order to fund climate, a massive climate agenda, big, bold, progressive agenda items that Biden never would have arrived at on his own, had not this movement 10 years ago injected those principles, those goals into the mainstream conversation. Those were far left fringe ideals that were voiced, as you say, a ragtag group at Zuccotti Park, but maybe people sort of, that was sort of youthful idealism, those principles, tax the rich, end corporate, rule, these slogans and memes that Occupy generated. Well, what did it produce? Frankly, the year after Occupy was cleared from the parks, you saw coming out of this era of Barack Obama, who had failed this idealistic progressive generation that had helped him get elected in 2008, and really represented the centrist kind of Clintonian democratic model of constant compromise, of kind of Wall Street money being just as valuable as the principles of the people that elected you, or much more valuable. What you get the year after Occupy was Elizabeth Warren soaring into her Massachusetts Senate seat, riding on the language of Occupy, the 99%, tax the rich, put more regulations on banks, help people in foreclosure crisis. And she immediately started to shift the language of the Democratic Party and the priorities of the Democrats. But what she began, you saw create a wave of Democratic mayors, progressives starting to put in these kind of populist proposals into their agenda. Bill de Blasio in New York, legislators putting forth, Millionaire Tax Act type legislation in Congress. And this all led to what we know as the big movement, which was Bernie Sanders, who put the Occupy principles into a political machine that said, take on the billionaire class, the 99%, tax the rich, make them pay, give us climate, give us healthcare, give us debt-free education. And he really put into form what Occupy had voiced, and he made real. And most people I talked to for the book think Bernie that was never going to happen if the ground hadn't been laid with the language that Occupy introduced, this populist language of the 99%. And of course, Bernie gave birth then to one of his volunteers in New York, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and the whole new generation of progressive anti-corporate Democrats who really shifted the direction of the party and brought us up to this moment of Joe Biden and a Congress which, for however little we believe they're actually going to get this done, does embody in many ways this new progressive kind of era that we have entered, what I like to call kind of a second progressive era, although it has yet to materialize and achieve its ends.
Yeah, so that's maybe a prelude to some deeper conversations about politics that we'll get to in a minute, because there is a flip side to that. But before too long, I wanted to kind of remind the audience of who you are and your, I would say, fairly distinct positioning as a journalist, as you know, going back and forth between more objective styles of journalism and advocacy journalism, and your experience with activism as well. How did you come upon this as a story, as a, you know, how did you end up in Zuccotti Park in New York in 2011? What drew you there? And were you seeing this at the time as something you were reporting on or experiencing and participating in?
Actually, I had been working closely with you the year before Occupy broke, and it was pretty serendipity. I mean, I think I showed up in New York. I was supposed to take a plane. It's on page 2 of the book where the story opens. I was supposed to go back to Europe and complete some personal life business, go get a divorce back in Berlin. And I had an intention just to get on a plane in New York, but I took this trip across the country. You know, I think we saw 2011, to bring us all back, was the year of the Arab Spring, right? It launched in December of 2010, January of 2011 was this outpouring, this eruption of demands, popular demands for democratic representation. People tired of being jobless, tired of not having work, possibilities, future, and a government that represented their needs. And this was a kind of a universal cry that we heard across the world in the aftermath of the Great Recession, remember, that was caused by our banks, our Wall Street financiers from Bank of America and Citigroup and, you know, Chase and et cetera, Wells Fargo, the big banks that took down the economy. I think many of us had expected protests to break out right here in America, but they didn't. It took the Great Recession. It took several years passing. It even took the Tea Party coming before Occupy in 2010, which was angry about the bank bailouts as well that Obama instituted with a slap on the wrist to the banks. It took all of this, and finally the Arab Spring broke, and that transitioned up to Europe in May of 2011 to the indignados and the encampments that spread across dozens of cities of Spain, where, you know, the youth, half of the youth under 30 were out of work, and Greece with the anti-austerity protests. The world was on the brink in this moment, if we can bring ourselves back and remember. Tens of thousands of students in Chile were marching and shutting down their universities to protest the high cost of education. In Israel, they built tens of thousands of people, built tent city in Tel Aviv to protest high housing costs. The world was a global movement. And then in September, as our government deliberated, as our Republicans failed to even consider a jobs plan, only wanted to defeat Obama, and the Democrats were doing nothing to do anything dramatic or help people underwater with the foreclosures, then finally the call came. It was a grassroots call from Adbusters out here up in Canada, and with an editor actually in Berkeley who put out that call, the meme, Occupy Wall Street. And it just started in a very organic way with some hundreds of people. I heard it on the radio. I was in Ohio when the news came in, and I thought, that's interesting. I'll take a look. This sounds like the movement we've been waiting to see. And I went down to the park. I was gripped. I'd never seen a movement like this before. I'd been in protest movements. I'd been an environmental activist. I'd been arrested in the old days up in the headwaters and the redwoods trying to save old growth forests. That was very different from being in the heart of financial greed at the epicenter of sort of the planet's, the corruption of Washington by Wall Street greed. We were there. I decided to stay. It was too dramatic, and I became part of the movement and helped start the newspaper, the Occupied Wall Street Journal, and everything flowed from there. It was something that I couldn't quite pass up. I just saw how obviously novel this was for this generation, which is kind of why I call it Generation Occupy. It really ignited a new generation, what happened in that park.
A lot of what impressed me about your storytelling was that I think the expectations were fairly low at the beginning, that, oh, this is just another protest movement. These are people who are coming out with very few demands. They just want to cause trouble. They just want to make a stink and maybe break some things. And this was pretty much the polar opposite, according to your telling. There were people who had been inside Wall Street financial system, who had deep knowledge and critiques about what was broken, regulations that weren't keeping Wall Street financiers to account, not putting anybody in jail for their financial crimes. How did this movement attract those kinds of people, and what kind of tangible, specific policy demands came out of it?
Mm. It attracted all sorts of people, right? It attracted the young, the people that the media, the Fox Newses of the world and the mainstream put on the front page, the kind of wild anarchist 20-year-old, mostly white, college educated. It attracted them. It attracted older people. I mean, remember, baby boomers came out in force for this movement across the country as Occupy sprouted nationwide. But I think focusing, it was this call. I think what's important to remember, not to dwell on what happened there and more to talk about the impacts of what Occupy spurred. But Occupy was this first call, calling out the system as the problem. And activism never looked like that because activism had focused on much more specific aims. There had been feminism in the 70s, there had been environmentalism, there had been the gay rights movement, there had been anti-imperialist movement. The global anti-globalization movement was so strong in the 90s and had real potential and hope and was building. And then we had the stolen election of 2000 and 9/11, and then the Iraq War and the massive protests that failed. Despite being really popular protests, they failed to stop that war. They were old school protests organized sort of from the top down by big groups, nonprofits, unions. It wasn't people's fault, but it was the old model of organizing, where protests used to be generated by a handful of people in kind of offices at the heads of organizations, and the message would filter out to the people who would then carry out protests everywhere. Occupy was different. It was this decentralized, no leader, and yes, that was a major flaw in terms of its building structure and maintaining itself and creating policy proposals and plans and achieving real ends. That ended up being one of the contradictions of it, that in order to start as this organic creature, it had to be this kind of sort of structureless and very horizontal movement. But what it created by inventing this new kind of activism is this era of decentralized protests that embraced and adopted that model. You see coming out of Occupy, Black Lives Matter, and I mean, I hope we talk about a few of the movements, but from Black Lives Matter to Standing Rock to the Women's March and the Indivisible movement that ended up torpedoing, Republicans' efforts to abolish Obamacare, to the climate strikes later, and even and the anti-gun violence, March for Our Lives. All of these movements in the last decade have had a decentralized kind of organizing model, and that didn't exist before Occupy showed the way that you can do that. Have a city where no one is in charge, and all of the cities and everyone's Occupy is contributing and strengthening the larger movement, but there isn't one at the top sort of sending a message down to the rest. Everyone is sort of in alliance in a decentralized way. Occupy invented that. And as to the people, there were so many incredibly creative, intelligent, wildly inspirational people at Occupy. And it's no surprise that the very people at Occupy Wall Street and at Occupy camps around the country, although I focused for this book on Zuccotti Park, where I was, so many would go on to participate in and help lead and help steer, or at least facilitate, give direction to these many other movements. People see them show up in Black Lives Matter, in Standing Rock, in the climate movement, and they became kind of leaders in their own right, helping steer this new era of movements. Occupiers did not stay at Zuccotti. No one expected people to stay camped out forever in the park, and they did not, but they went on literally to shepherd in this new era of activism.
The initial critique, the most salient in the wake of the the financial crisis and the massive foreclosure crisis was economic inequality. And that really sparked a real dollars and cents urgency on the part of people organizing working people. And to what extent did the labor movement change? And what kind of new demands came out of the labor movement? Was it more decentralized than it had been in the past? And we're now kind of at the nadir of organized labor across the country. What's changed in the last 10 years that was informed by this rhetoric and the vocabulary of the 99% versus the 1%?
I think that's a huge point. It's so often overlooked. I feel I've been following these strands. I know many people have. Anyone who came out of Occupy and is interested in these issues, progressives, I'm sure have kind of noticed the interweaving throughout this last decade of kind of, yeah, the 99% being echoed in these various movements. But I don't think the connections are often drawn just how much Occupy helped reorient and give a new sense of muscle and belief and courage in the labor movement in the country. That's my argument in the book, is that really coming right out of Occupy, this message that workers and the 99%, no one's looking out for you. The folks at the top, your bosses definitely aren't. The guys who are making the 300 to 1 salary ratio in boss to employee that corporations now have or had 10 years ago, they're not looking out for you. The ones shipping your jobs overseas definitely aren't looking, and cutting healthcare and benefits and pensions. And I think workers who had been at a low, as you say, a nadir, I mean, Ronald Reagan in the 80s came in and in 1981 fired the air traffic controller workers, which sent shockwaves through the labor movement and made a message, kind of like Maggie Thatcher over in England in the 80s, of this is the end of worker demands and worker power. This is the time of profits and of corporate bottom line. And if you don't like it, go find another job. But this is going to be the new normal. It really, labor unions and organizing took a major hit, and they didn't recover. And through the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, and even through now, though now we see a new uptick, they really needed they didn't have anything that was taking them out into the streets to make clear demands. What happened the year after Occupy is we saw fast food workers in New York City organized by Occupy Wall Street people, along with community groups, nonprofits, clergy. But Occupy people were right there on the ground floor, organized the first walkout strikes of several hundred workers that launched the fight for a $15 minimum wage. That caught wildfire. That was like the next chapter in the inequality debate that Americans readily tuned into. Quickly, it went across the country. It went to dozens and then 50 and then hundreds of cities where demands for a higher living minimum wage, $15 an hour, which was unthinkable only a few years earlier, suddenly became a realistic demand. And more than 30 states, about 30, passed, and red states, many of them, Arkansas, Alaska, tons of states that are traditionally conservative, passed higher wage laws. So there were immediate impacts. And this transferred into the whole middle and lower wage sector. Walmart workers struck. They had Black Friday strikes that I think many of us remember. Occupy people were very involved in those. And those had the impact of raising wages for 500,000 workers at the world's largest retailer. You had domestic workers striking, hotel workers, adjunct professors, bus drivers. You had whole waves, shop market clerks, supermarket employees. People across the economy had a stake. They realized, and it's not that they were thinking, of Occupy or the 99%, but the 99% message had reawakened in people this sense that the demands must be real and must be made to sustain. And then, of course, the biggest, I think, of the labor movement were the teacher strikes nationwide across Red State America. It was called the Red State Revolt in 2018 because it started in West Virginia and Oklahoma and Arizona and these states that aren't used to people coming out and raising a ruckus at their state houses and refusing to go to work because they want to get paid more. So it took off nationally, this sense that people have a vested interest. And what we see now in the resignation economy, or the Great Resignation, as people are calling it, is that in the coronavirus era, I think that this is now pushing people as a natural evolution to say, I don't need that. I'll either take some government, a bit of aid that the government is now offering, or go find something else. But people, this rediscovered empowerment of workers is real now. And I think corporations are feeling that, and the government.
There are all sorts of other experiments, like the universal basic income. I mean, there's been many other ideas that have sort of come out of this creative ferment in the progressive camp that I don't think really got taken seriously previously. But I wanted to turn to some other topics because there's a ton of them that you address in your book. And this does segue from economic justice, the whole idea of the Green New Deal. And you mentioned AOC and her the coalition that she's managed to push through in Congress to demand climate justice. How did the street movement, how did the bottom up decentralized organizing from 10 years ago influence her and then the rest of the Democratic Party in particular in terms of its climate awareness?
Yeah, that's the climate. I dedicate a whole chapter in the book. There's one chapter just on social movements and how Occupy reshaped activism more broadly. But climate, which is also within that activism, it's so urgent and so of this moment. Look at what we have, Glasgow and the big UN summit happening in a week from now starting, where the world it's in the balance, right? Everything is hanging on whether we can do something. Climate deserves its own real focus. And Occupy's impact on the climate movement is so clear and, to me, so direct. And that's another thing I don't think we generally recognize. I mean, coming right out of Occupy was not explicitly dedicated or had a message for climate change. I remember at Zuccotti when they came out with when we did the declaration of the occupation of New York City, the founding document of the movement, climate change, environmental issues, it was way down the list. As we recall, Occupy had a whole lot of grievances, way too many to address in one systematic sort of fix. But climate wasn't sort of among its many ones, at least not high up. But what we saw really quickly coming out of Occupy, we saw Hurricane Sandy, first of all, the year after Occupy was cleared in 2012, November, the same week that Barack Obama was reelected, was Hurricane Sandy, Superstorm Sandy, which swept through New York City and the whole eastern seaboard, and Occupy people who had vanished from the streets and disappeared from people's memory in a sense because it was a year old and people weren't thinking about it. They took the streets and demonstrated how in a new era of climate calamity and instability, mutual aid, direct action, people on the street getting real resources to those in need can have major impact. And they beat FEMA to the jump. They beat the Red Cross to the ball. They went and organized and got, batteries, food, blankets, mold removal. They took people, they did an Amazon registry to get supplies and resources. They opened up 2 churches where people could come for weeks before really the big lumbering bureaucracies got aid to people. They showed, Occupy Sandy showed how this direct action movement actually is having real tangible impacts. But that was just the beginning. From there, the movement really transitioned from inequality and an argument against the 1% on Wall Street to this idea of the 1% in the fossil fuel industry who are taking down our planet. It was a kind of a natural pivot, but it took, these years to make it happen. It took the argument against the 1% economically for then people to say, you know what, fracking, we're seeing our cows drop in our fields. We're seeing our hair fall out. We're going to protest this new form of resource drilling that is hurting our health. It was the first tangible climate impact that people actually affected their lives right there with dirty, polluted water and fire blowing up in their sinks. The anti-fracking movement grew right out of Occupy Wall Street. Many people went right up to the Northeast, Pennsylvania, New York, upstate, and organized these protests. And then out west, it grew even further. Remember the Keystone XL pipeline coincided with Occupy. It was like there wasn't really a real environmental climate movement before Keystone. There was an environmental movement, but it didn't really have teeth. It didn't have direct action, aggressive, robust organizing by people who are willing to put their bodies on the line. Keystone changed everything, and it came with Occupy, and they stopped that pipeline that was incredible, and no one thought it could be stopped. We thought it was a done deal. Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, they were going to sign it. They didn't. The protests were so sweeping and across the country by grandmothers, by ranchers, by cowboys, and by Native Americans, college students, everyone. They put it to an end. But that led to this wave of anti-fossil fuel protests that really, there was a divestment movement led by students who initiated on their college campuses, really spurred by the energy of Occupy. They wanted to know what they could do. They started a divestment movement and now today it's $15 trillion, that movement that was begun on a handful of college campuses in the US, which expanded into a global cause. But out west, people put their bodies on the line. They stopped coal trains, natural gas export terminals, oil pipelines up in British Columbia, in Washington, and Oregon, all these sort of coal, the export facilities that were supposed to ship fossil fuels to China, the kayaktivists who went up to confront the Shell platform out off of Seattle. It was just a wave of Occupy energy transitioning with the same Occupy people and just this new direct action willingness to say enough of taking our future. And then of course, the people who came out of Occupy Wall Street started organizations like one that I really profile in the book called Momentum, which trained young people, millennials and Gen Z, the really young people who today are in the streets and are spiriting this new era of climate action, trained them to think more pragmatically about how to organize a movement, how to achieve policy aims, how to get real laws changed. And these groups started by Occupy people from Zuccotti helped form the group that became the Sunrise Movement, which was actually one of the co-founders, who is the person in the chapter, Evan Weber, who I kind of follow his trajectory. He was marching at Occupy Wall Street when he was a 20-year-old junior at university and came out to march. And now a decade later, I mean, he's a co-founder and one of the leaders of this climate movement. So it's this direct transition from Occupy to the Sunrise Movement, and you can bring it right to the global climate strikes. Greta Thunberg, of course, is over in Europe and, not connected explicitly to Occupy, but what it started in America when she came and the students poured out in this decentralized form of organizing across the country, millions of people globally. We saw that, and Extinction Rebellion, the great descendant of Occupy, in the sense that not only were many people in Extinction Rebellion part of Occupy, but it uses so many of the same tactics to stop business as usual, make people stop what they're doing and think and realize that we need to take the climate absolutely seriously. So this wave in a decade I find it impossible to discuss the modern climate movement without this real recognition of what Occupy brought to the game.
Wanted to pick up on a thread going back to the Keystone XL pipeline. It wouldn't have been successful had it not really started with the Native American community and had a real resonance with connection to the land. And Occupy Wall Street, as you hinted, was at least reputed to be a largely white middle class movement. And to what extent did the Occupy Wall Street fights for Native American rights and the Black Lives movement in particular, Black Lives Matter movement in particular, how did they intersect? I don't know if there's a straight line from one to the other, just in terms of chronology, because they were interweaving agendas for a very long time. To what extent did they reflect each other in terms of organizing style, demands, and ability to communicate with a mass population.
Right. Interesting point. I knew I had to tackle that, and it was a difficult topic to address in the book. And people I interviewed and spoke with really gave frank responses, but it was clear that I couldn't tell some correct story about how this evolution occurred. I think, but I really do try to address this. It's a fascinating interweaving. Occupy was, as you say, perceived and in many ways was a white, middle class, college educated, all these kids in their 20s. They didn't reflect the real 99%. The real 99% is black and brown and working in jobs and wasn't about to come out and occupy a park with a bunch of, kind of anarchist looking kids in the streets. So that was right off the bat a real tension and a contradiction of the movement. It calls itself the 99%, but are there black people here? Not too many. Are there Latinos, Mexican? Not too many. Native American. So what we saw, however, and that those tensions were exposed early on at Occupy, when it was like, are we here to protest the banks, or are we here to do racial justice protests? There was Trayvon Martin got killed in Florida in the winter of 2012 when Occupy was underway. Troy Davis from Georgia was executed right when Occupy was beginning, and people wondered, should we protest this or should we stick to the banks message? And it really created a kind of a fissure right off the bat. Like, well, you're not going to be in solidarity with African-American issues. You're just going to do kind of white issues and attacking Wall Street. Immediately this tension. But talking to people about Occupy and this legacy and the years that have gone by since, it's clear that people made a correction on that earlier maybe blindness, like cultural or racial, the blindness to see the broader connections. Like when Black Lives Matter happened, many Occupy people jumped right in. Occupy people helped in big ways in infrastructure, in technology, spreading that, amplifying that message, using this technology that Occupy essentially had invented, the new use of social media as a political tool. Remember, it had just come into our pockets. The iPhone had not existed universally as a camera ready to document police brutality and document the great inspirational scenes that we're seeing in our streets. We hadn't seen that before Occupy. The technology and the moment kind of converged, where all of a sudden you had viral videos going out and drawing people into the streets and creating a kind of protest loop where they would see what's going on their screens and come out and join protests in real time, in real life, which would generate more protests and more screen time. And it created a kind of virtuous cycle like that. That was this really creative experiment. I don't know if everyone was aware that that's what was happening, but in the aftermath, we could see that's what occurred. Those same techniques were instantly employed at Black Lives Matter, which many people think did vastly better and more advanced work in that sense than Occupy Wall Street. And it was also in terms of promoting, in terms of showing, documenting what's going in the streets, documenting both police brutality and the protests that were peaceful, that were just and righteous outrage in the streets. But the same, and Standing Rock too, what we saw obviously in 2016 toward the end of Obama's term, that was a real white people of all kinds coming from across the country, coming to the support of Native Americans, becoming water protectors with them, by their side. Native Americans had occupied before at Alcatraz in the 70s. Whites weren't there at their side then. That was Native Americans doing their own thing. This at Standing Rock was people saying, enough, your crisis, your conflict is our conflict. Your water is our water. It's our climate. And people came and it unified these issues and showed sort of this, again, on the climate front, it kind of elevated, made the Occupy argument a whole larger universal sort of existential argument. But in terms of Black Lives Matter, I just want to say that it was the economic critique at Occupy, economic inequality, and it was the racial critique at Black Lives Matter for racial inequality. And I think that this last year, what we saw with the George Floyd protests, finally, with the unity of white and black and everyone in the streets protesting that moment and protesting for greater racial justice, was really this, that they came together, that the economic and racial inequality and injustice are now, we see them as the same thing that they are, that Black, brown communities are both oppressed in racial terms and economic terms, and that all of us are under this system. And so I think we've really seen in this decade, yes, the tension early on, but a real evolution and a sort of solidarity that is only growing stronger. I mean, the movements are now really at a point of greater maturity.
And yet, there is a flip side.
There always is.
The very language of the progressive movement of highlighting the rapaciousness of the elites, and the resentment of the masses. All of these frames have been, I would say, really deftly and intentionally hijacked by the right-wing movement. A lot of the same tools for inspiring people to engage in the political process, however they see fit, have arisen in more populist tones. So to the extent that that the last 4 years of our politics has been dominated by populism, what are your reflections on how we got to Trump, and where we go from here in terms of the messages that can be sent either from the left or the right to that same constituency of people who feel left out of the economic
right
bounty of the country.
Right. That's the question on all of our democratically oriented minds, right? We want to preserve what we've got here and make it a lot better rather than see the whole thing fall and fold into autocratic fascist future, as Trump openly introduced us to. I think that, and yeah, in the book, I do talk about this tendency. It's like an uncomfortable truth, right? The movements of 2011 that gave birth, that sprung out from Europe, Arab Spring, which of course had their great disappointments, to ours and across the world, they were primarily of kind of what you would think of as the left, or the left populism, the Spanish, the Greek, the anti-austerity protests. And for a while, that seemed to be the movement that was going to characterize the decade of the teens, was this sense of left populism. We saw Occupy Gezi in Turkey come up, where people occupied their park, modeled off of Occupy Wall Street in their own way, and had their own park library and everything else. And it was this beautiful moment protesting the Erdogan regime, very much kind of the left, the environmentalists of Turkey. You had the bus fare protests in Brazil, huge protests that they sometimes call the Brazilian Spring, that were Occupy-like. They were against inequality in the lead up to the Olympic Games and the World Cup, where they were spending vast amounts and corruption on all the building of stadiums, and people had enough. They didn't have a living wage. They took 4 hours to get to work, and living in favelas. They had uprisings all that year in 2014, that summer. Protests spread and they looked from the left. But in Brazil, as we saw, they started on that left side, and very quickly that angered middle-class white Brazilian, the more established, middle to upper middle class folks who had reactionary ends in mind. They ended up calling out the government and jailing Lula and getting rid of Dilma as their president and installing Bolsonaro as their leader. And look where they have. It's kind of similar, Bolsonaro, as many see it, to Trump. I mean, we have that tendency happened in America too, this left populism. And we see, of course, across the world, the right-wing anti-immigrant It was just a wave. It was fueled by, of course, in Europe, it was fueled by the Iraq and Afghani and Syrian refugees who flooded in 2015 and created this real wave of anger and xenophobia from white Europe that felt threatened, and the white working class that did not want to see. And so in Poland and Hungary and France and you name it, Finland, all of Greece, the same countries that had the leftward movement, Spain, Italy, all had their real right-wing reactionary, far right sort of populist movements. But I think what we saw here in Trump against who? It was Trump against Hillary, but what was it really? That 2015 primary season was really a primary season of Trump against Bernie in many ways, because the populist energy of the country, whether Bernie would have won or not, irrelevant to ask now, and it doesn't exactly matter. But the energy, the outrage and the power of a movement, it wasn't with Hillary, it was with Bernie. It was folks on the left. But of course, Trump's was stronger and angrier and had focused, 3-word memes, lock her up, do this. He won it on his right-wing agenda, demagogic right-wing, populism. But Bernie represented so many of the same angers, the right and the left. Trump articulated many of those same grievances, right? Shipping jobs overseas, no one's paying attention to you. They're laughing at you on Wall Street. And of course, Trump made the elites, the press, us, journalists, the whole media and Hollywood, and it focused on other forms of elite. But Bernie also, they both said it was always about the 1%. It's about those folks who do not represent you, this corrupt system. Bernie and Trump had so many of, in that sense, similar kind of civic partnership. Hillary was for it. Both Bernie and Trump were against it. They didn't want to ship more jobs over to Asia. So I think that the big solution, or what, when I talk to people for the book, is really to look at how popular Bernie was, look at that West Virginia and across the South and in places where people are struggling and need help and need jobs and need a future and opportunity. Bernie talked to that. Bernie reached those people, a lot of them, in a way that Trump did too. But Bernie, if you want the left rather than the right to win, you talk to those people. You try to explain to them why the infrastructure bill. I saw a note come in on the chat right now, talk about the infrastructure. I mean, that's why Bernie is shepherding and is steering that. Bernie is the spokesperson for what this entire reconciliation package could be for the country, lifting up working people, poor people, middle people who are getting pushed down ever further. Bernie articulates that. Trump does it in the most crude way and a false way, because he never had any intention of lifting them up. He gave $2 trillion in tax cuts to the wealthy and corporations, whereas Bernie and this package, whether it goes through or not, whether it gets downsized to about, a sliver of its former ambition, that's the idea. So I think that if the left wants to get pragmatic and talk to people in ways that really resonate and makes people want to vote and march and demonstrate and side with that vision of the future rather than the January 6th insurrection vision of the future, then I think they have a good model in what Bernie and AOC and the progressives who are just banging on those issues: $15 wage, debt-free education, free childcare, climate solutions. I think that each place demands different different versions of that message. West Virginia, obviously the climate message isn't getting through there, so you tailor it. But I think there's a way to do it if they're shrewd enough.
Yeah, so this you pretty much answered this question, but maybe you can expand on it in terms of like what ultimately did happen, and whether the political split that we find ourselves in right now, kind of like the schism, came out of this kind of organizing, or was spurred on by this kind of organizing. The question is, do you think the Occupy movement has reinforced or negatively affected the support that Trump has received from his voter base in 2016?
That's beyond my let's go to, I'm not quite understanding that. That seems like kind of a version of the question you asked. We'll go, how about talk about some of the actual other impacts? I'm not understanding.
I guess the question is, the questioner is probably asking, to what extent did the organizing on the ground in the Occupy movement rile up the right wing? That's my interpretation. And would Trump have ever happened, the Trump phenomenon have ever happened, had the left wing gotten itself together and organized?
That is an interesting question. Many people I spoke with in the book did make that comparison in many ways, where they say Bernie never would have happened had Occupy not happened, because that language, that rhetoric, the 99%, the outrage against the elites, it hadn't been articulated and laid the ground for Bernie. In many ways, people said Trump was an outgrowth of Occupy. I mean, really what he was an outgrowth of the Tea Party, which preceded Occupy. So I don't think he really needed Occupy to lay the fertile ground of populist anger. But I think certainly the country was ready to, many people, poorer people, less educated people, but who had gotten the gist of what this populist anger was about, even from Occupy, even if they didn't like or identify with Occupy. It was in the air. Inequality was now a conversation. Why am I not getting more? Where's my raised wage? All of that filtered through the culture, whether you liked Occupy or not. It became the new discourse. Remember that, austerity was the conversation before Occupy. It was all anti-austerity. Let's cut budgets and cut spending and make our budget sort of, you can't spend away, you can't give people more in a time like this. Occupy changed that conversation. It brought inequality to the center of our economic debate. And that did filter across, I think, to everyone. And people thought that was a pretty good idea. Yeah, tax the rich. 3/4 of the country thinks that's right, including Republicans. So I don't think that, Trump probably would have happened regardless. But yes, it did. The ground was more prepared by this resentment and populist kind of anger, and probably seeing the left surge up as strong as it had, as the culture wars show today, the kind of threat that the left in its populism and street protests, the threat that poses to older, white, grievance-based America that doesn't see itself getting enough. I think that probably was another spur. But I think one place to look is France with the Yellow Vest movement. I write about them a little in the book. That's a place where the left and the right populism intersects, where they aren't really on the right or the left. They are, maybe they're primarily white. Yeah, they're French, but they're also tractor drivers. They're the farmers. They're the poorer people. They believe climate change needs to be addressed, but they don't want the costs of it put on their backs with higher fuel taxes. That's what launched that movement. They're this interesting intersection of right and left outrage, anger, populist legitimate grievance that needs to be listened to. And I think that might represent more of the future, because if Occupy or a future Occupy will be actually palatable and successful in the future, I think it probably needs to get away from that left versus right and speak that language, kind of like Bernie was in a way, of a really like broad-based. You don't have to be on either side. It's the masses versus the very few at the top. It's a vertical thing, all of us down here and the people up there. And it's that pointing the finger at the culprits that sort of was the mastery that Occupy introduced. And I think movements need to keep that language, keep that going. Maybe you want to bring in other voices to sort of bring in any questions of people who'd want to.
Yeah, I think we have about 5 minutes left in the conversation. If there are any other questions, you can put them in the chat. And I still have a few more, maybe to close out, lacking any other comments or questions. Oh, okay, we have a long one here. You mentioned that Occupy Wall Street did not have any leaders, but you also mentioned that the folks from Occupy Wall Street moved on to other protests, such as Black Lives Matter, climate, Keystone Pipeline, etc. What is the profile of the 20 to 30-year-old whites who moved in from the initial movement to others? What did they do before these movements? How can they financially sustain themselves moving from one movement to the next?
Well, There's actually a nonprofit for that. That's a funny question. Good question. How do activists sustain themselves? I think that's something that activists ask every day, and probably people, the more cynical right-wing side, who says, what are you doing out in the street? Go get a job, which was basically the line that everyone gave to Occupy people. Don't protest inequality. Don't tell me how the system's rotten. Just go get a job and shut your trap. That's kind of the Fox News argument, right? I think that that's a very easy way to say, how are you sustaining yourself? What are you doing to live this life? Activists are always struggling with how to actually live and live their values, live their virtues and what they want to do. But coming out of Occupy, actually, one of the women I profile, she's actually right here on the West Coast, Leah Hunt Hendricks, was a Yale educated. I think she already had or was working on her PhD at the time of Occupy. She started this group out of Occupy, coming out of it, called Solidaire. And she comes from a rather upper class background. Her grandparents were oil tycoons from Oklahoma and Texas, the Hunt family. She was of the 1%. She was at Zuccotti Park, a 1%er in Zuccotti, a young, educated, Ivy League educated woman who, and not alone in that, there was Brooke Lehman, another person I profile in the book, who was of the Lehman family, the Lehman brothers, who took down the global economy in 2008, September. Another sort of like descendant of the 1% who wants to do different with their lives. Leah Hunt Hendricks started this group, Solidaire, which donates money and creates infrastructure that allows, to address the question, allows activists to go from movement to movement. Its whole intention of this philanthropic organization, which put millions of dollars into Black Lives Matter, into groups like Standing Rock, or I don't know if it expressly went toward not the Women's March, but various organizing in the Trump era. I'm sure the climate movement and Sunrise, all sorts of racially, economically, justice movements. The whole idea was people need to sustain them. They can't just go out, have a movement, expect to continue it for weeks or months on what? Living on air? Pizza donations only last so long, like they did at Occupy. So how do activists stay in the streets or stay doing what they're doing that's so important? You need to build an infrastructure. So that was one. Solidaire is this one institution that was started out of Occupy precisely with that in mind. But I think that's always the crux of the issue for activism. Why aren't there more activists out there? I don't know. I live in the Bay Area, where all anyone ever talks about is technology, and all anyone makes is over $100,000 a year, unless you're, like me, renting a house, in the suburbs of San Francisco. It's like, it would be great to be an activist full time. Everyone is up to their neck in struggling to stay economically here. So how do you do that? You're either young and free, or you have some kind of support mechanism, or you work, jobs. But it's like being an artist or something. Being an activist is like you do it while you also sustain yourself. If there were great philanthropic ways that people want to support groups, I think that would really help, because all those young people out there need support to do what they're doing. Occupy needed a lot, but it did it all on the bootstrap anyhow.
What you're saying is anti-institutionalism needs to be institutionalized.
Definitely. First thing. Absolutely. Get the 1% to give it's all going to happen. It has to happen somehow organically by those with principles to make it happen. But that's constantly the struggle, right? The system sustains itself. Capitalism keeps being capitalism. The 99% don't win because the 99% are enthralled, are beholden to the system that is keeping them kind of from going out and camping out in the street to rebel. If people are angry or desperate enough, maybe they will do that. But until then, we're all part of the game.
So just wrapping up, and you are pushing books, and I urge you all to buy this book and to discuss it with others, because as I said, it is an important book. And as you can probably tell from Michael Levitin's facility with bringing in all of these ideas and all of these movements and kind of putting them all in context, it really helps sort of clarify and make sense of what has been a really confusing decade, I think. Who do you hope reads this book? Who is this book for?
Who's it for? It's for the next generations. I think a lot of people who write, yeah, it's for us to understand better, clearly. I'd love people today to read it. I would love that. I would love that to help. It was written really certainly for people today to learn, young people, primarily. The most important in my mind that would read this would be young people to see what we got wrong and how we have learned and corrected, and each movement is building, to not lose hope that these movements have failed, because they don't really actually, it's hard to talk about a movement like Occupy failing. That's what always stuck in my craw about the media. Andrew Ross Sorkin, the well-known New York Times financial journalist, wrote on the 1-year anniversary of Occupy back in September 2012. And I always remember the line because it's how he started his opinion piece. Occupy will be an asterisk in the history books if it gets any mention at all. And that was how sort of main.
But you proved him wrong.
Well, I don't know. I hope we did. Yeah, it'll at least have a book out there. You can get this maybe in the future if you don't read his, op-eds. But this idea that movements, people who I talked to for this, activists, lifelong activists, they talked about how movements don't materialize overnight. The civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, Gandhi. I mean, you look at any movement, it doesn't just, people hit the streets, they had demands, they had goals, and then they won and they got them. It never happens like that. It didn't happen like that with FDR and the New Deal. There were socialists and anarchists and communists and workers, unions striking from the teens and the 20s. There was this buildup into the 30s and the desperation of the 30s when they finally said, you make those changes or we're going to overthrow this government and you're going to have a revolution. Then FDR acted. It was decades in the making. And civil rights with Martin Luther King, that took years. And I think what some people say for the book is like Occupy's impacts are only now in the 20s will we maybe start to see the real impacts, because of the kinds of things I was trying to show in the book, that these trends are really like a big wave building and they are gathering force and it's evolving. But I think that future people now, say the students that I'm teaching at community college, 20-year-olds, they need to know where the current movements, the climate strikes, the March for Our Lives, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, all of these are building on each other's shoulders, as Occupy built on anti-globalization and the civil rights struggle and everything else, but that these keep building. And there isn't some success moment that Occupy had to, some policy achieved, and then it was kind of over. It's never ending. As we know, this struggle is never ending, as is the final line in my book. Occupy is never ending. The 99% will always be battling the 1%, as it has always been, as it will always be, in a sense. But we need to achieve some lasting victories. And I think young people should be aware of this history. I hope in the future, when we look back on this chaotic and, as you say, really hard to understand decade, where we're already forgetting the pre-Trump era in our minds now. It's almost hard to even remember the Obama years, given what we've been through in the last 5 years. I hope that that people, if they read this, will see that there's a lot of hope and there's a lot of growth, and that we're really building towards something much more lasting and hopefully with serious consequences in terms of getting real work done. Maybe we'll see it in Congress over the next weeks. Don't hold your breath. But like, if we did see it, if we saw debt-free education, childcare, expansion of Medicare and healthcare, a climate core, you could say, a little thank you, like, great, thank you, Occupy, for helping put those issues into the mainstream and getting them at least the motive, getting people elected that could bring those issues to the public and help our lives.
Well, we've come full circle to the present. So that was a great wrap up. Yeah, thank you so much, and thanks to the Columbia NorCal Alumni Association. I don't know if you wanted to take it away and talk about the organization and any other upcoming events or ideas coming down the pike?
No last questions from folks before breaking. I really appreciate those who've stayed on and stayed through the lengthy discourse. Love to have any last people, but otherwise, thank you very much, everyone who has stayed, and thank you, Michael, and the Columbia, Dan and Irene, and people who helped put this on. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much. This was really fun.
So yes, well, then that would be it. I hope this is the book. You can find it in your bookstore. You can email me about it. I could even send you an author copy if you're really hard up budget-wise. And yeah, thank you for participating, friends and people I don't know on this call, and appreciate it. I guess we will log off here. Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, Michael. So Michael, I wanted to thank you, Michael Levitin and Michael Stoll, for leading this discussion. Thank you for sharing your work to a wide range of our guests, especially the younger generations that you hope to reach. So I'm hopeful that your work will teach many of us to learn from our past and towards an equitable future and lasting victories. So for any additional questions, is there a way for our guests to contact you? Is it through LinkedIn, email?
I'm definitely on Facebook and LinkedIn, and malevitin@yahoo.com has been my email for about 20 years running, malevitin@yahoo. And, you know, I have a website, so I think people can just please Google my name, get in touch. I'd love to hear from people about impressions of the book, questions, any of the rest. Thank you, Irene.
Okay, thank you, Michael. And everyone, thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you in the future. So.
Wonderful. Thanks all. Great. Bye-bye. Good night.